and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Paige Bailey about improving developer productivity through machine learning, aka GitHub's Copilot. But before I start, let me tell you a little bit about my latest project, awesomecode-reviews.com. Yeah, all my work on code reviews has now its own dedicated home. At awesomecode-reviews.com, you can find articles about code reviews, best practices, code review checklist, news about the latest research on code reviews, and of course, workshops and courses I offer around this topic. So please hop over to awesomecode-reviews.com and check out my latest work. But now back to Paige. Paige is the Director of Machine Learning and Machine Learning Operations, aka MLOps, at GitHub. Before that, she was the Principal Product Manager at Microsoft and also worked on DeepMind and at Google. Paige has had over a decade of experience with machine learning and data science as a practitioner. Paige also told me about the great opportunity for all my listeners today, which is getting into the beta program, which is super hard and has a very long waiting list, for code spaces for data science. So for everybody that is listening and that would like to get a chance to try out not only code spaces, but also other awesome extensions like GitHub Copilot, you can win that today. What do you have to do for this? Well, just like and retweet today's episode. And for an additional chance to win, you can also leave a comment about what kind of data science work you're currently doing or what you like to do. So isn't that really cool? But now back to Paige. I'm so happy that she's here with me today. So welcome, Paige. Welcome to the show.
Excellent. I am very excited to be here and to talk to you about how machine learning can be used to improve developer productivity and also the great work that we're doing at GitHub to try to make it into a better home for data scientists and machine learning engineers.
Yeah, both topics are super close to my heart. I would really love to learn more about that. But I would also like to know a little bit more. What is a director of machine learning or machine learning operations? What is your responsibility? What do you do? And how do you get there?
That's a great question. And the role is very new at GitHub. So it's only been around a couple of months. And that means that I kind of have the pleasure of being able to help grow it and to define what that role actually looks like. But the primary focus is really around this goal of making GitHub a better place for machine learning engineers and for data scientists to do their work, to collaborate with their teams, and then to also deploy and maintain models in production. So to that point, many millions of repos today have things like Jupyter notebooks in them. We haven't done a lot of work historically to make Jupyter notebooks, kind of a first-class data type on GitHub, but that is changing. And so as part of this work, I get to collaborate with a lot of teams across GitHub, but also across Microsoft. So particularly the VS Code team, they've been building out wonderful extensions and tools and features for their IDE, as well as Azure ML. And so many of the features that we're adding to GitHub's machine learning products are using Azure ML products behind the hood. So you're able to get all of that sort of goodness within your application, within kind of the projects you're working on, without necessarily having to go through the mechanics of setting up all of the infrastructure yourself. But that's kind of the idea. So it's like professional machine learning cat herder. Is kind of the idea.
Yeah, I think this is so important. And I'm just thinking back when I was working at Microsoft, we did a study on code review comments and the value of code review comments. And we looked at when is it easier for people to give good code review comments, that are helpful, valuable for the code author. And we saw that the way how we present code, obviously, right? And if it's now maybe production code, or is it like C# code, or is it YAML files or Jupyter notebooks, right, made a big difference. If there wasn't a good diffing, if it wasn't nicely presented, it was really hard for people to give good code review feedback. So Yeah, I'm super excited that you will work on that and really tackle that problem to make it easier for people to review also code that I think is quite complicated sometimes. I would say it's
Yep.
sometimes more complicated than normal code if you have like a machine learning model somewhere and you have to understand that. What's your take on that?
Exactly. Like the process for reviewing Jupyter notebooks on github.com today is quite painful. So to your point, when you view a notebook PR, it's still in its raw JSON format. If there are output images, it's really, pretty much impossible to kind of see them. That is something that we're hoping to change, within this year. And in the meantime, if you're looking at a PR on a notebook within GitHub and you hit the period on your keyboard, you're immediately launched into github.dev, which gives you a nicer VS Code facing interface to do the review for the notebook. You can see it nicely rendered, and you can also leave the comments that you were just mentioning. So it's a lot more pleasant. And to your point about data science code being trickier than like normal source to review, I think you are 100% correct, especially since so often data science code is both describing a scenario as well as having a code snippet and some sort of output. Much of the time, those outputs are kind of random, right? Like they're not deterministic. If you're sampling from some sort of distribution, and you sample 10 points, you're probably not going to get the same 10 points. And if you sample twice. So making sure that those considerations are, sort of front of mind as we're building out these systems. And also, working closely with data scientists, machine learning engineers, code review experts like yourself, to make sure that these things are landing in a way that's delightful, and that works for your use cases.
Yeah. And so there's the tooling on one hand, but there's also the process on the other hand. In my
Yep.
experience, and I think it changed over time, right?
Yep.
As data scientists are more and more, I think, more collaborative than like 5 years or 10 years ago. But
Yep.
I still see a lot of lonely rangers or people, especially at
Yes.
companies that are a little bit smaller, there's only one data scientist or, one
Yep.
person that really understands this machine learning model. And so sometimes it's really hard to get others on board and get feedback from them.
Yep.
How do you see that from a process perspective for code reviews? What can we learn there, and how can we shape the processes around code reviews so that it fits scientists, researchers, also, right,
Yep.
and data scientists?
I'm so excited that you mentioned that, because there have been so many instances where data science work happens just as you described. It's all local development. You might have a Linux workstation and a GPU under your desk, and you're just rapidly iterating in this notebook context. You might have intermediate steps where you dump out a CSV, and then there's not really this concept of version control, because if you're working in isolation, then it doesn't quite seem like it's worth the time to take for version control. Whereas what we're hoping to have happen is, if folks aren't familiar, code spaces is a way to immediately launch a development environment that's attached to a GitHub repo. So you could imagine a scenario where you have a project. You're spinning up compute directly from GitHub. So if you see an interesting repo that's on Papers with Code, you can click a button and immediately you have compute attached, storage attached, and you can play with it with all of the dependencies included. And as you make changes as a data scientist, this is all in your browser. So it feels a lot like Google Colab, if folks have familiarity with that, or Databricks notebooks. And these changes are automatically version controlled. So you don't have to worry about it. And when it comes time to perhaps take that notebook or machine learning model to production, it's easy to say, hey, software engineering team, all of the artifacts, all of the version history, all of this kind of past knowledge, it's just right there. Like, go take a look at the repo. If you have questions, definitely ask me, or ping me on live share. But it's at least it's a little bit easier in the sense that all of the work is kind of centralized in a single place, and it's a place where data scientists feel comfortable, but also software engineers feel comfortable.
Yeah, this sounds
Yeah,
so exciting. I think even for
yeah,
normal code reviews, right? If you are going not now into this data science, area or field, but for normal code reviews, I always say it's so cool if you can have like a PR preview, right, where you
yep,
can click on it and look at it. And obviously, code reviews, it's not testing, but it's always nice if you can run the code, if you can give it a spin, if you can, if you want to try it out, you can try it out. And I think for data science, this is even more important, right?
yep,
And you play around with the code. So I'm super exciting about that. Yeah, very,
yep,
very cool.
yeah,
And what about Copilot? I want to talk a little bit about this because I think a lot of people are extremely excited.
yep.
And I saw actually a tweet from you on your Twitter, and it was you used Copilot to explain you a little bit what's going on in
Yes.
the code, right? And so now that we are talking about this kind of code, or in general, code is difficult to understand, but I think machine learning models, etc., are even harder to understand. How can GitHub's Copilot really help us to understand code? Is that really something that's doable, or was it just a toy example where we say, okay, here it works, but in general, it's not that helpful?
It is. I am, over the moon excited to have Copilot as kind of a partner collaborator, as I write code. And it's precisely for the reasons that you mentioned. So for folks who perhaps aren't familiar, Copilot is an extension for VS Code, as well as other IDEs. So if you're more of a fan of PyCharm, if you're more of a fan of other sorts of environments, Copilot is also available for you. But it generates source code. So for example, if you type out a comment explaining, I would like to merge these two columns in a pandas data frame, or I would like to or I would like to normalize, the values in this column, or I would like to take this data frame and build a scatter plot, or whatever it happens to be, even outside of the realm of data science and machine learning. You just describe what you would like to do, and
Mm-hmm.
then Copilot suggests source code that accomplishes that task. And that was kind of its first iteration. And now we're starting to investigate more and more opportunities to apply similar concepts to the end-to-end development lifecycle. So, as you were mentioning, the latest feature that was added is the ability to highlight a code snippet, and then to say, hey, Copilot, please explain this to me. Like, what on earth is this code doing? And it works surprisingly well. Just like, when I first heard about Copilot, I was very skeptical that, like, oh, okay, like, all right, yeah, like, so I will describe a thing and then it will give me a code snippet. Like, I guarantee you it probably will not work well enough for me to want to use it. And then it's gotten so much better as the months increase. So shockingly good that like I am happy to stay at GitHub for as long as GitHub will have me, just so I know that I constantly have access to Copilot. But
Yeah,
yeah, but
cool.
it's great. And the source code descriptions are it's both the code that you've highlighted, as well as any of the functions that perhaps are defined elsewhere, but that are highlighted in that code snippet. So if you're calling a function that's defined in either a library that you've imported or a Python file within your project, it still looks and inspects those locations where the function is defined
Mm-hmm.
in order to give you better descriptions of what the code is actually doing.
So it goes in both directions. So I either write natural language and it magically gives me snippets, and I know that I can, hop through different snippets and, find the ones that I'm more happy with or that I trust
Yep.
more. And then I can do the reverse, saying, well, this is the code that I would like to understand. And it produces some natural language around that.
Yep.
Yeah. Another thing that I saw is that it's also helping you write tests, which I think are also extremely important, not only for
Yes.
tests but also for understanding reasons, right? Because if you have tests, it gives you a use case for this code. You can also, I think, you can learn a lot from test cases. There was also a paper by Alberto Baccelli and others around code reviews. And when you start the code reviews actually from the tests, which are somehow use cases of the code, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could see that code reviewers actually perform a better job. And so I
Nice.
wonder if you can also use Copilot a little bit to generate test cases around something that you don't understand, and you see input outputs, and it creates a little bit of model for how it's actually used. Um,
Exactly. And
yeah.
the way that you can do that is just as simple as saying, like, perhaps a function is defined somewhere above, like if you're operating in a Python file and a function is defined towards the top. All you would have to do is kind of add a comment to the effect of like test out, this function with these values,
Hmm.
or even just say test function name, and then hit enter, and then Copilot goes through the work of giving you a testable code snippet below. Like I said, it's shockingly straightforward to do these things, and I feel like it's honestly made me better at code reviews, better at collaborating in general. Because to get the best recommendations from Copilot, you have to be very precise with language,
Hmm.
and very specific about the task that you're trying to accomplish. So you have to know exactly what you want to do, and then and that's the only way that you can get these really nice, very accurate code snippets.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so it's a little bit like test-driven development on one hand, right? Where you have to understand your requirements quite well to
Yep.
specify the test. And I think here the same, right? If you have to write down this comment very precisely and in a good way, then you have to know your requirements. And I think this is
Yep.
so important. And very often, a lot of developers just jump in and they start massaging, and then you have this code, and then you realize, oh, actually, I forgot to think about this part, right?
Yep.
So yeah, I can imagine. What about people that are not native speakers, like myself, right? So have you probably have tried out with people that are not native English speakers when they write down? Is it still working, or does it have problems?
I think, just like every large language model, this is an area of active research of, trying to make sure that there are consistent performance across every single kind of language. So I've tested code comments in at least a couple of other languages. And I know that colleagues have tested with, so for example, Mandarin characters, or other types of language comments. It works, but being a native English speaker myself, I speak German, but that's the only other one really fluently. It's tricky to say for definitive, like, yes, this is performing better, or no, it's not performing as well as it would be with English. But this
Okay.
is something that we're investigating,
But
and making
is
sure.
it sourcing from, because I can imagine like always like the English body of work that you have for your models and the
Exactly.
data is, it's much larger. The data set is much larger. Is it
Exactly.
sourcing from a global data set, or would it then source from Mandarin, for example?
Right. So that's a great question. And to your point, the source that it's trained on, is really all of the code snippets that we can find on the internet, but primarily GitHub's public source code. So not any private repos, just
Hmm.
public repos. But the majority of those are implemented in English language. And so,
Yeah.
just like any other machine learning or deep learning experiment, um, you're kind of beholden to the data that you have available to train the model. And so we've explored some techniques around kind of fine tuning, but mostly fine tuning based on programming language. So, for example, Copilot performs much better on Python, JavaScript, things where there's a lot of code publicly available,
Hmm.
um, uh, in terms of computer programming languages. And then for things like, say Fortran, it performs a little bit less accurately.
Accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the same for spoken languages. So if the majority of the source code is implemented in English and the comments are implemented in English, then that's the best performance we're going to see. And we can fine tune for other languages to try to get better performance, but it's always going to be a bit tricky to have parity across each kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people waiting to get into the the
Yep.
technical preview. I'm on the waiting list. But when will it be available for the public? Do you have like a date already in mind? Is it like this year or?
So I do believe that we're hoping to GA Copilot this year.
Mhm.
And though the specifics around that are still being discussed, should it be teams? Should it be, like different usage tiers across GitHub? Should it be, individual access? Still very much up for debate. But I agree with you. Like it is very exciting, and we're hoping to get it out to GA as soon as we can.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So another topic that I wanted to talk with you about is security vulnerabilities, and especially
Yes.
how to find them automatically, which brings me also a little bit to automated code reviews. And people always say it's automated code reviews, and then when I look a little bit closer, I think it's static and dynamic analysis of the
Yep.
code, and then we just have like the comments of instead of having this output in our command line or somewhere, we have it as PR comments. Um, what's your experience with that? Was there really a lot of invention over the last 5 years in terms of it's really automated code reviews? And what I also sometimes wonder is if these PR comments are not too late. I'm more the fan of a pre-commit hook, right, where you have
Yep.
your code in your IDE and this is wrong right now and you can fix
Yep.
it, than being pushing it up to GitHub and then having a PR comment there, going back to your IDE, changing it. So how do you see this whole process with automated code reviews? How does it work? And what are some of the tools that that are really helping us here?
Those are wonderful questions. And I think that you're right that often the automated code reviews are just kind of checking code for formatting or those sorts of things, as opposed to actually a little bit more intelligent suggestions about how the code is structured, or
Hmm.
like perhaps this should be extracted into a class method or something like that. So I do think we're getting a little bit better, and we're just beginning to start applying deep learning techniques to things like detecting security vulnerabilities, doing code review. But this idea and this concept of sort of um, having an automated check to the developer before the PR even occurs is my preferred route as well. And so there's I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Python extension in VS Code, but it's currently only working for Python files, though we're adding Jupyter support too.
Hmm.
But it does things like recommend refactorings.
Okay.
So like
How's it
name check,
called?
the Python extension for VS Code.
Yeah.
Yep. And
Okay.
so it's just kind of, and I don't know how well the refactorings are advertised because I didn't know about them up until just recently when I started to work with the team.
Mm-hmm.
But they've started, like, you'll see these little light bulbs, kind of similar to the little light bulbs that exist for Visual Studio. And if you click one of these guys, then it gives you suggestions for, like renames and some other things. But also, one of the examples that I've been most excited about are recommendations for when to extract functions from these big bulkier blocks of code,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not sure if you've had similar experience, but the data science code that I normally see, or the research code, it's not super modular often. It's like you have data ingestion and you have like pre-processing steps and visualization steps and the model piece, and they all might be part of the same big thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and any sort of nudges to refactor that is great. And the but I do think that there are opportunities to apply, things like natural language models to suggest perhaps better names for functions, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if Copilot is capable of explaining code, then maybe it can also do things like say, hey, like this function is named in a way that's not quite understandable. Like perhaps you should call it something different, or uh, this function doesn't have a comment. Like here's an example doc string that you could use
Mm-hmm.
to explain this function, that sort of thing.
I also wonder about consistency because
Yep.
very often I think consistency goes way beyond any other practice, right? So, for
Yep.
example, for naming, having consistent names, like let's say instead of saying maximum sum, and
Mhm.
then you say sum min, right?
Yep.
You're switching it. It's somehow confusing. So having the
Yep.
consistent naming, for example, or having consistent style within your project, and I think this is are really good opportunities for machine learning because you can find the patterns how code is written of the majority of time, or if you specify this is how it should look like, and then find ways where maybe it's not written in the same
Yep.
consistent way and style. Is that something that you're exploring as well?
It's I'm not sure if we're exploring it within GitHub itself, but we
Mm-hmm.
might within DevDiv. And I know that in DevDiv, for example, the IntelliCode team is investigating things like merge conflict resolution or
Mm-hmm.
suggestions for merge conflicts. And so I wonder if they might also be investigating some of these opportunities to encourage consistency in terms of naming, or similar sorts of things. But it's
Yeah.
it's a it's a great idea.
Yeah.
And I also, like, this is also a convenient time for me to say Microsoft is hiring. So if anybody would so
Yeah.
if anybody is interested in such things, yourself included, Microsoft is certainly hiring, and we would love to have machine learning folks who are concerned about developer productivity and who care about these experiences
Yeah, I will link
join the team.
that. I will link
Yep.
that in the show notes so that people
Yep.
know where they should send their CV or
Cool.
maybe page you or something. So maybe to bring something a little bit different into the mix, because we are coming a little bit to the end of the show.
Yep.
When I looked at your GitHub profile,
Yep.
I found something that's called page views, which I really love. Right, like your view on things.
Yep.
And there were two that I wanted to talk with you about, and one was
Mhm.
it was bring data to opinion fights, right? And I'm
Yes.
just reading what you wrote there, and it says like folks who are adept at spotting opportunities to apply machine learning and automation to existing business processes will inherit the earth. That's
Yep.
the only way to win, by bringing data to opinion fights and making every decision data driven, right? And I'm a huge fan
Yeah.
of data driven decisions. But I'm also always a little bit skeptical, where I say we have to balance the qualitative with the quantitative, right? So I'm
Yeah.
always I'm always saying you have to be so cautious with this quantitative data because it tells you a lot of what's going on, but not really why.
Yep.
And so it can easily lead to wrong decisions or opinions and so on. What's your take on that? And how do you balance, like if we say data driven, right? How do we balance this deep understanding of data with the quantitative, way of, but when we have an understanding, we can quantify it.
Yep. And to your point, all data is biased, right? Because
Yeah.
all data is collected by humans and by instrumentation, which has flaws. But the data that we use for machine learning experiments, for deep learning experiments, and just for analysis, like to understand productivity metrics or telemetry, all of that had a kind of a human behind the decision of like, oh yes, we should measure this and not measure this other
Mhm.
thing. And so to your point, the data that we collect, we need to be very cautious about, what we do choose to measure. And then also humble enough to recognize that, the data can tell us about users who are already using our tools, but it can't tell us anything about people who haven't tried them yet,
Mhm.
right? Like the telemetry that you have for a given product for like button clicks or like usages of functions or those sorts of things. It can tell you kind of present state activity, but it can't tell you like, oh, the reason why people aren't using this function is because they don't know about it, or like discoverability and the documentation is low, or we don't really have kind of helpful hints in the IDE that would nudge them towards these behaviors. So I think the best recommendation is always to be curious, to constantly ask why, and to constantly question your data, to make sure that it's the correct thing to be including as part of your analysis. Whether it makes sense to kind of hang your hat on a particular metric as the thing that you want to increase, as opposed to really, again, just constantly trying to better understand users and to recognize that no matter how much data you have, there is no way that any of these quantifiable metrics can sort of give you a single understanding of any user, right? Like just like a person can't be reduced to like an SAT score or a GPA or
Yeah.
whatever that is. You can't solely rely on metrics to understand folks.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think a really good example, and I'm going now completely out of our area here, I think is COVID, where we have
Yep.
all this data which is presented without any context of how did it was collected, why was this
Yep.
included, why was it not
Yep.
included. And I'm always like, this whole pandemic, I think the thing that stressed me out the most was like people presenting data and like just even already conclusions based on some data where they have no idea about how did we even collect it, right? What does this even mean?
Exactly.
Who was included? Who was excluded? Why did we do it this way? And so this is also why papers, like if we think about scientific papers, the results section is tiny, right?
Yep.
And there's this large methodology section where actually we can really, or we have to really look deeply to understand if our conclusions or the results actually make sense, or make sense for how we interpret them, right? Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And then maybe the last thing, and it's also a page view, is give without expecting a return. I really like that so much. It was so resonating with me. And so you
Yep.
said someone very wise once told me that throughout a career, you will meet people and you will help, support, and encourage them, not even thinking about it. But those influences will change lives. And if you're lucky, you will find out later.
Yep.
I think this is so beautiful. And did that happen to you? Is it happening constantly? How do you apply that in your day to day work?
Yep. That is so I have been so fortunate that, and it has happened many, many times throughout my life. So an example that I was just thinking about this morning was when I was an undergrad. I had emailed a professor at MIT just kind of because I think everybody has heroes growing up, and I had seen some of his research, and I was like, hoping to grow up to be like this guy. Whenever I was a geophysics undergrad,
Mm-hmm.
and he recommended, I mentioned that I was interested in programming, that my first computer was an Apple II. I had made text adventure games. I had gotten into MATLAB, or started getting into MATLAB for some of my coursework. And he recommended that I check out Python, because it was becoming increasingly important in kind of the space sciences and the natural sciences, etc. And I was prepping to apply for planetary science research internships. Um, and so I did. And like, based on his recommendation, my entire career trajectory changed. That was over a decade ago, and I'll never forget it. And my first computer, my family, I grew up in a very small town. I did not, we didn't have much money, and there was no one really around who was a computer scientist. But the library was about to throw out an Apple II computer that had been donated,
Mm-hmm.
because nobody could figure out how to get it to work. And a family friend who was an electrician, told my mom. Like, my mom took it back home. They got it up and running. And that also, ended up being kind of a life-changing thing that
Yeah.
was just a 30-minute act of kindness. Right? And
Yeah.
so,
So nice.
yeah, so I think that, that is constantly happening through all of our careers. And, we're all so fortunate, like, to be able to be part of this field, and to have, kind of the background, and the teaching, and the experiences to work in the tech industry, and to help build these systems that really power the world, and help empower them to build other things, or to do their jobs more efficiently. So that's if there's anything that I can do to help others, that's forefront of my mind all the time.
Yeah, that's really nice. Okay, Paige, this actually brings us to the end of this episode. I want to remind our listener about, that they can get a technical preview, like a beta seat,
Yep.
for code spaces and Copilot for data science. If you retweet
Yep.
and like the episode, or let us know what you're doing data science wise right now. And I also will link the Microsoft career thing.
Yep.
So if you want to apply. And yeah, is there something else that you would like my listeners to know, or something that you want to give them on their way while they are navigating this space?
Absolutely. Try out GitHub for your machine learning projects. Try out github.dev, VS Code, and its extension ecosystem. And we are always, always open to hearing your feedback, and to your sort of your ideas for how to make the platform better for data science and machine learning work. So that is my one ask. Download VS Code, download the Python extension and the Jupyter extension. Use it for your work, and tell us how we can improve.
Cool. Yeah. And how do we tell it? Do we write you on Twitter? Do you have open DMs, or do you write it via email?
Yep, I'm dynamic web page pretty much everywhere on the internet.
Okay.
So DMs work, and then also dynamic web page at github.com.
Okay. Cool.
Yep,
Cool,
yep.
cool. Thank you so much, Paige. Thank you for your time. It was really a pleasure to talk to you, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. This was another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please help me spread the word about the podcast. Send the episode to a friend via email, Twitter, LinkedIn, well, whatever messaging system you use, or give it a positive review on your favorite podcasting platform such as Spotify or iTunes. This would mean really a lot to me. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.